In the previous slide, we outlined the evolutionary perspective, which is one of the most widely accepted explanations for the origin of facts, promoted both by today's mass media and by various scientific institutions. Before we move on to the next concept regarding the origin of facts, it is worthwhile to make certain observations about reality that may support this perspective. It is worth noting that for the purposes of the evolutionary theories, the term genetic algorithm was coined. We can now begin to use this term. Although genetic algorithms function in computer science as one of the heuristic optimization methods and have, in a sense, taken on a life of their own, in our considerations we will limit ourselves to defining a genetic algorithm as a real algorithm for optimizing the maintenance of life on Earth. We may ask ourselves why we refer only to maintenance rather than, in the evolutionary sense, development from so-called primitive organisms to complex ones, even though a single cell, indeed every cell, is already complex. Here, we will understand this as the progression from the single-celled organism to a multicellular one endowed with a conscious mind. We have used the term maintenance rather than development because, for the time being, we do not know, nor are we able to simulate, observe, or describe the operation of this algorithm in such a profound sense. Of course, theoretical models associated with various evolutionary interpretations may suggest that such descriptions of real observations have been made. However, we know that we do not observe such profound changes in nature. According to evolutionary theories themselves, such changes will practically never be observed due to the extremely long time scales involved. Therefore, they will always remain a matter of pure theoretical considerations. Thus, in the case of genetic algorithm, let us remain within the framework of the observable maintenance of existing life, using also observable genetic mechanisms such as the 5 basic ones: genetic drift, gene selection, genetic mutations, inbreeding, and crossing over. However, we will not limit ourselves solely to the purely technical details of mechanisms occurring in genes. Within the scope of this definition of a genetic algorithm, we will also take into account the operation of the objective function itself. That is, the conditions that compel us to adopt specific behaviors in order to achieve so-called success in the world, as well as the success of the satisfying the needs of the conscious mind itself. What appears most interesting, however, is that evolutionary theories do not satisfy the basic needs of the conscious mind, which may suggest that the conscious mind itself may not be a mere product of hypothetical evolutionary processes and that evolutionary processes themselves appear to be merely a tool for utilizing the conscious mind in order to achieve some overall, though not clearly defined, purpose. However, let us return to the problem of consciousness. Namely, we do not truly know what consciousness is. To this day, scientists, thinkers, theologians, and philosophers are unable to define what consciousness truly is. I still remember that several decades ago, there was a prevailing belief that the human mind was merely the result of computations taking place within neural networks. Thus, it was assumed that it would be sufficient to create a sufficiently complex artificial neural network, structurally similar to the brain, and consciousness would emerge spontaneously. Today, we already know that this is nonsense, and so-called artificial intelligence is nothing more than a more complex program, capable of modification or, more proudly stated, learning. Returning to the topic, evolutionary processes themselves appear to be hostile to the conscious mind, which is enslaved by them and unable to resist their manipulations. On the one hand, these processes compel the conscious mind to engage in specific actions, effectively undermining its sense of dignity, morality, values, and freedom. On the other hand, they reinforce it positively, keeping it on a certain course through praise, recognition, and instilling a sense of superiority, satisfaction, and pride. In the simplest term, the applied method of pressure and manipulation can be described as a carrot and stick approach with elements of indoctrination. It is worth noting that the engagement of the conscious mind in processes of evolutionary struggle for survival dynamically stimulates the spheres that we consider to be the worst and at times even immoral, such as fear, pressure, ruthlessness, baseness, pride, hatred, a sense of revenge, a sense of threat, a sense of injustice, jealousy, desire, hypocrisy, anger, maliciousness, but also those that, in the context of the objective function, are considered positive. Thus, a sense of victory, but also a sense of superiority, pride, the satisfaction of revenge and retaliation, the fulfillment of desire, and so on, often lead, from our point of view, to the worst and lowest form of behavior, which I will refrain from listing here. In the simplest term, we can state that evolutionary processes operate against the standards of good and evil encoded in our conscience. Sometimes that drives our actions and which in the context of the evolutionary objective function should be considered good, we regard as bad. Despite this, when observing the surrounding world of predators and prey, we are often faced with the choice of remaining a predator or becoming a victim, with an obvious preference for the former option. Thus, against our conscience, we justify our actions by the realities of life, and in the certain circumstances, we arrive at extremely immoral behavior. In summary, we can state that the evolutionary system is a system of enslavement of the conscious mind, compelling it to adopt specific behaviors through external pressure or manipulations of its essential aspects of consciousness. Returning briefly to the topic of consciousness, as I have already mentioned, not only is there no way to create or digitally simulate consciousness, but there is also a lack of mathematical model or even an objective definition of it. When defining it, we rely on terms known to us from personal experience. However, we have no idea what it actually is, how to model it, or how to produce it. We know that the brain, treated solely as a neural network, will not generate consciousness on its own. It is therefore necessary to ask whether a genetic algorithm operating through purely computational techniques is capable of generating consciousness, which, although it appears to be connected to the physical world, may extend beyond the domain of computational methods, and thus beyond the purposes evolutionary models. Additionally, in opposition to the theory of the progressive evolutionary development of life on Earth, stands the observed facts not of the flourishing of life, but of its extinction and even the deterioration of the entire natural environment, including the state of genetic material. Here, one could, of course, use the argument concerning the harmful activity of the conscious mind and the redirection of the evolutionary development toward scientific and technological achievements, which nevertheless does not strengthen the assumption of the evolutionary historical model of the origin of life. An important observation is also the remarkable complexity of life, which, when compared with human scientific and technological achievements, appears to represent an incomparably greater accomplishment. Taking into account only the general observations discussed on the previous slide, one may consider an alternative concept of the origin of facts, in which the key element is not the natural environment itself and its purely mechanistic aspects, but rather the observer, who assigns it meaning and significance, namely a conscious intelligent mind. And in the process of creating both the conscious mind and its living environment, a similar conscious mind may have been involved. Therefore, we will attempt to assume that although we observe the brutal mechanisms of life and death, they were not the means by which life on Earth arose and developed, but were introduced as a result of defect in an otherwise correct implemented design. Thus, from the perspective of the conscious mind, the world was designed and created as perfect, that is, in such a way that all processes, mechanisms, and laws interact with one another to ensure the comfort of life for conscious beings, providing access to sufficient resources. Since we have assumed that the world was close to ideal or exactly ideal, what we observe is the result of a defect in the operation of a correct design in which limited resources are distributed through the exploitation and death of other beings, including beings capable of conscious thought, as we may interpret in this first oval comment. We assume that facts originate from a perfect world which at some point experienced a failure or into which a defect was introduced, whether unintentionally or perhaps even in an intentional or even planned manner. In the diagram, we consider the two most commonly taken into account possibilities. Either the designer completed their project, which was subsequently completely abandoned by them, as we can see on the left side in this oval comment. Or the designer implemented their project, which, despite the occurrence of a defect, is still being controlled by them. This can be read in the oval comment on the right. In the case of the second option, that is along the green path, we see in the black block a counter-argument that challenges the claim of the designer's ongoing control over the execution of their project. We observe a lack of any observable intervention by the designer in natural processes. Thus, natural processes occur in accordance with certain, albeit approximate, predictions we are able to make. They are, so to speak, measurable, calculable, and predictable. Of course, we are referring to processes that occur within the observable and definable world accessible to us, which we are able to see and investigate. We do know, however, that there are certain domains of reality that are still beyond our reach or will never be accessible to us, such as measurements in quantum physics or the possibility of conducting reliable research in distant regions of the cosmos. On the green path, we assume that the designer's intention was to create and subsequently maintain control over the project despite the defect that arose. However, this may occur at a level that we are unable to control or investigate. Thus, in general, intervention in observable natural processes is not required, or such intervention occurs only sporadically. We can, of course, assume that such a designer did not exist. And here the supporting argument will be the comment in the black block, namely that there is no observations of the designer's intervention in natural processes, therefore the view of the designer's existence cannot be regarded as a fact due to the lack of evidence. However, we may equally assume that the designer did exist, as in the red path, but that the project was subsequently abandoned by them. Similarly to evolutionary concept, this constitutes an argument based on the absence of facts, however, it remains, of course, an absence of facts. Nevertheless, many people are inclined to believe that some form of God created the world and then simply departed, leaving us to our own fate. We do not know what purpose such an act might have served. This is what we can observe in the blue block on the left side. However, the project still exists and, despite its brutal form, continues to sustain life, including conscious life. Of course, here we assume the existence of a designer. We may also consider the possibility that rather than a world created by a designer, it is a perfect world that emerged from some origin and subsequently became defective. The defect itself, however, may have been introduced by some catastrophic phenomenon, or the project may have been altered as a result of the actions of the conscious beings that were created. For example, we could now potentially destroy the very existence of life on Earth by unleashing a nuclear war. Similarly, in the past, something comparable may have occurred, which could have led to such catastrophic and irreversible consequences, resulting from an improper choice made by conscious beings, whether they were created or produced by certain natural processes. Although in the absence of a designer, we of course do not know where these processes originate from. Alternatively, we may even have been given such a possibility of choice as one of the options introduced by the designer. So, in the past, the conscious mind may have had a fundamental influence on how life developed on Earth, and perhaps even throughout the entire universe.